Have you ever wondered what secrets lie buried in the government archives about the true origins of America's most devastating weapons? What if I told you that deep within the classified vaults of the Los Alamos National Laboratory, researchers recently uncovered evidence that one of our nation's most lethal military innovations wasn't created by the celebrated scientists we've been taught to revere, but instead has its origins in ancient Cherokee knowledge that was systematically erased from our history books? Before continuing with this video, take a moment to comment where you're from and hit that subscribe button. We need your support to continue bringing these hidden truths to light, stories that powerful interests have worked for decades to keep hidden from public knowledge. The year was 1942. As America mobilized for war following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the most brilliant scientific minds in the nation were being recruited for a top-secret project that would change the course of human history. While most Americans are familiar with the Manhattan Project and the development of the atomic bomb, few know about the classified program codenamed Cherokee Constellation that ran parallel to it, a program so secret that even most Manhattan Project scientists were unaware of its existence. What we found in the recently declassified files defies conventional historical understanding, explains Dr. Marcus Whitecloud, a quantum physicist and member of the Cherokee Nation who has spent the last 7 years petitioning for the release of these documents. It appears that a critical component of America's nuclear program, specifically related to the precision detonation mechanism, was derived from traditional Cherokee mathematical concepts that predated Western understanding by centuries. The story begins with James Red Bird, a Cherokee mathematician who was working as a high school teacher in Oklahoma when the war broke out. Red Bird had earned a Ph.D. in theoretical physics from Princeton University in 1938, studying under Albert Einstein himself. But like many Native American intellectuals of his era, he found academic positions close to him due to pervasive discrimination. Red Bird's academic papers from his time at Princeton show that he was already developing theoretical frameworks that merged traditional Cherokee mathematical concepts with quantum theory, says historian Dr. Eleanor Silverhawk of the Indigenous Science Historical Society. His dissertation on what he called interconnected wave functions across dimensional boundaries was so advanced that Einstein reportedly told colleagues it was either complete nonsense or 50 years ahead of its time. When the war began, Redbird attempted to enlist in the Army but was initially rejected due to a childhood injury that had left him with a slight limp. Instead, he continued teaching mathematics and physics at Sequoia High School on the Cherokee Reservation, apparently resigned to sitting out the war effort entirely. That changed in February 1942 when 2 military officers and a civilian scientist appeared at his classroom door. According to recently declassified minutes from a meeting of the Military Applications Committee dated March 7, 1942, the recruitment of Redbird was prompted by a remarkable coincidence. Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, who would later become the scientific director of the Manhattan Project, had come across one of Redbird's theoretical papers while researching potential solutions to the detonation problem facing the atomic bomb's development. Oppenheimer immediately recognized that Redbird's approach, which he had dismissed as mystical Native American thinking during their overlapping time at Princeton, might hold the key to solving the precise synchronized detonation challenge, notes Dr. Whitecloud. What's particularly fascinating is that Redbird's equations were derived from ancient Cherokee concepts of harmony and balance, specifically from what our elders called the 7-pointed star of creation. This traditional Cherokee symbol, which represents the interconnectedness of all elements of creation, had been translated by Redbird into a mathematical framework that essentially predicted quantum entanglement decades before mainstream physics would catch up. More importantly for the war effort, it offered a theoretical basis for creating perfectly synchronized detonation across multiple points, exactly what was needed for the implosion-type plutonium bomb. When Redbird arrived at the secret facility in Los Alamos, New Mexico, in April 1942, he was not initially told the true purpose of the project. According to his personal journal, which was only declassified in 2021, he believed he had been recruited to work on advanced radar systems. The truth was far more significant. "They put me in a small office away from the main research buildings," Redbird wrote in an entry dated May 2, 1942. "I have been instructed to develop my theoretical framework for simultaneous activation across spherical boundaries without being told what application they have in mind. The isolation is clearly intentional. The few other scientists I've encountered regard me with either curiosity or suspicion. One asked if I was part of the janitorial staff. Despite this isolation, Redbird's work proceeded rapidly. Drawing on the Tsalagi-Givge-Yuhi, the ancient Cherokee mathematical system that had been passed down through oral tradition for generations, he developed equations that described how multiple points on a sphere could be triggered to move inward at precisely the same instant, with perfect symmetry. What makes this so remarkable, explains theoretical physicist Dr. Richard Featherman of MIT, is that Redbird was essentially describing quantum tunneling and entanglement using mathematical concepts derived from Cherokee cosmology. His equations show that he understood, at least intuitively, principles that wouldn't be formally recognized by mainstream physics until the 1970s. By August 1942, Redbird had completed the theoretical framework. His equations, which he called the harmony of synchronized movement, were presented to a small group that included Oppenheimer and General Leslie Groves, the military head of the Manhattan Project. According to minutes from this meeting, recently obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, Oppenheimer was stunned by the elegance and functionality of Redbird's solution. "This resolves our primary detonation sequencing challenge," Oppenheimer reportedly said. "The symmetry is perfect. If it works as described, we can achieve the precisely timed implosion necessary for the plutonium device." What followed, however, reveals the darker side of this story. After Redbird presented his work, he was systematically removed from the project's official records. A memo from General Groves to the War Department, dated September 3, 1942, states, "The contribution of the Native American consultant has been secured. For security purposes and to maintain scientific credibility of the project, his role should be redefined as that of a technical assistant rather than a primary theoretical contributor." In other words, Redbird was being written out of history, even as his ideas were being implemented at the heart of the most significant military project of the 20th century. "They took my father's work, and then they took his identity," says Sarah Redbird Johnson, James Redbird's daughter, now 83 years old and living in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. "He returned from Los Alamos a different man. They made him sign so many secrecy agreements that he believed he could never speak about what he had done, even within our family. It wasn't until after his death in 1983 that we found his hidden journals and began to understand. Those journals, written in a mixture of English and Cherokee and kept hidden inside a hollow wall in Redbird's home, tell a story of scientific contribution and personal betrayal that challenges our understanding of one of history's pivotal moments. "When I saw the test at Trinity," Redbird wrote on July 17, 1945, "I recognized immediately what had been built with my equations, the perfect symmetry of the explosion, the way it expanded in an ideal sphere. This was the Tsalagi-Givge-Yuhi, the sacred geometry of my ancestors, transformed into the most destructive force ever created by humankind. I do not know whether to feel pride or horror." The Trinity test, conducted in the New Mexico desert, was the first detonation of a nuclear weapon in history. The successful test led directly to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki weeks later, bringing World War II to an end. Official histories credit the implosion design to various Manhattan Project scientists, particularly mathematician John von Neumann and physicist Seth Nettermeyer. Redbird's name appears nowhere in these accounts. The erasure was systematic and deliberate, explains Dr. Silverhawk. Redbird was removed from group photographs. His name was redacted from meeting minutes. His office at Los Alamos was reassigned, and his personnel file classified at the highest level. It was as if he had never existed. After the war, Redbird was prohibited from publishing in scientific journals or discussing his wartime work. He returned to teaching at Sequoia High School, where he remained until his retirement in 1975. According to family members, he suffered from recurring nightmares about the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and experienced periods of deep depression that he called his dark seasons. He would say that knowledge is neither good nor evil, but what we choose to do with it reveals our true nature, recalls his daughter. He believed that the Cherokee mathematical traditions were meant to help us understand harmony in the universe, not to create instruments of mass destruction. That transformation of purpose haunted him. The story might have remained buried forever, if not for a chance discovery in 2015. During a digitization project at Los Alamos National Laboratory, a technical archivist came across a box of microfilm labeled simply CR Theoretical, 1942-1943. The microfilm contained dozens of pages of equations and diagrams, many annotated in a distinctive handwriting that didn't match any of the known Manhattan Project scientists. These equations were unlike anything I'd seen from that era, says Dr. Lawrence Blackwood, the archivist who made the discovery. They used standard mathematical notation, but were structured in ways that seemed almost mystical. Concentric circles representing dimensional relationships, interconnected nodes showing what we would now call quantum entanglement. At the bottom of one page was a small symbol, a 7-pointed star inside a circle, drawn in what appeared to be red ink. That symbol, the traditional Cherokee 7-pointed star of creation, provided the first clue to the document's origin. After years of additional research and declassification requests, historians were able to connect the equations to James Redbird and the classified Cherokee constellation program. What they discovered was that Redbird's contribution went far beyond theoretical mathematics. The precision detonation mechanism based on his work, which utilized multiple precisely synchronized explosive charges to create a perfectly symmetrical implosion, was not only crucial for the first atomic bombs, but became the foundation for all subsequent implosion-type nuclear weapons developed by the United States. In the most literal sense, Redbird's adaptation of Cherokee mathematical principles created the triggering mechanism for the most destructive weapons in human history, notes nuclear historian Dr. Richard Rhodes. The irony is almost unbearable. Knowledge from a people who had experienced near genocide at the hands of the U.S. government was used to create the ultimate weapon in America's arsenal. For the Cherokee Nation, the revelation of Redbird's role has evoked complex emotions. There is pride in knowing that our traditional knowledge contained such profound mathematical insights, says Principal Chief David Walkingstick. But there is also deep sadness that these concepts, which our ancestors developed to explain the harmony of creation, were used to create weapons of such devastating power. The recently declassified documents reveal that Redbird himself struggled with this contradiction. In a letter to Oppenheimer dated August 30, 1945, just weeks after the bombing of Nagasaki, he wrote, "What troubles me most is not that our knowledge was used, but that it was used without understanding. The Tisalagi Givige Yuhai describes balance and reciprocity in all things. We have created perfect symmetry in destruction, while ignoring the need for symmetry in moral action. This imbalance cannot sustain itself." Oppenheimer's famous quote after the Trinity test, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," echoes Redbird's concern about moral imbalance. What few knew until now is that Oppenheimer and Redbird had several philosophical discussions about the ethics of their work during their time at Los Alamos. There are references in Oppenheimer's private papers to conversations with the Cherokee mathematician that profoundly influenced his thinking, explains Dr. Whitecloud. Oppenheimer was fascinated by Eastern philosophy, particularly the Bhagavad Gita, but these newly declassified documents suggest that indigenous American philosophical perspectives also shaped his understanding of the moral implications of the bomb. As more documents become available, historians are beginning to piece together the full extent of Redbird's contribution to the Manhattan Project. Beyond the crucial implosion mechanism, there is evidence that his understanding of what he called matter-energy balance states, derived from Cherokee cosmological concepts, may have influenced theoretical work on nuclear chain reactions and neutron reflection. We're just starting to understand how significant his contribution really was, says Dr. Silverhawk. The traditional Cherokee understanding of interconnectedness and cyclical processes, which Redbird translated into mathematical form, provided insights that Western scientific tradition, with its linear and reductionist approach, had difficulty grasping. For Sarah Redbird Johnson and her family, the gradual acknowledgement of her father's role comes decades too late for the man himself, but represents a crucial correction to the historical record. "My father never sought recognition," she says, "but he did want the truth to be known, that the knowledge of indigenous peoples has value, that our traditional understanding of the universe contains profound truths that modern science is only beginning to comprehend." The James Redbird story raises uncomfortable questions about who gets credit for scientific discoveries and how indigenous knowledge has been systematically appropriated and then erased from the historical record. It also highlights the ethical complexities faced by indigenous people who participate in military or scientific projects that may conflict with traditional values. "My father told me once that he felt caught between two worlds," recalls Sarah. "He was educated in Western scientific tradition, but carried the ancient knowledge of the Cherokee. He believed that bringing these perspectives together could create greater understanding, but instead he watched as one world took from the other and then denied the debt." In his later journals, Redbird reflected on the spiritual dimensions of his work. The seven-pointed star teaches us that all elements of creation are connected, that actions in one dimension inevitably affect all others. He wrote in 1972, "The weapon we created demonstrated this truth in the most terrible way imaginable. A single event transforming matter into energy, with consequences that continue to ripple through time. I fear we have created an imbalance that future generations must somehow rectify." That fear seems prescient, given the subsequent development of ever more powerful nuclear weapons and the continuing struggle for nuclear non-proliferation. What Redbird could not have foreseen is how his own story would eventually emerge from the classified shadows, challenging our understanding of scientific history and raising profound questions about cultural appropriation at the highest levels of national security. The Redbird case isn't unique, notes Dr. Silverhawk. Throughout American history, indigenous knowledge has been extracted and repurposed, while indigenous peoples themselves were marginalized. What makes this example so powerful is that it involves one of the most significant technological developments of the modern era, a weapon that transformed global politics and continues to shape our world today. As researchers continue to dig through declassified files and piece together the full story of James Redbird and the Cherokee Constellation Program, new questions arise about other indigenous contributions that may remain hidden in classified archives. How many other Native American scientists, mathematicians, and engineers had their work appropriated and their identities erased? What other traditional knowledge systems may have been secretly incorporated into military technology? For the Cherokee Nation, Redbird's story represents both a point of pride and a caution about the potential misuse of traditional knowledge. Our ancestors developed their understanding of mathematics and physics by observing the natural world and recognizing its inherent harmony, explains Cherokee traditional knowledge keeper Thomas Firecrow. They would be troubled to see these insights weaponized, just as Redbird himself was troubled. But they would also recognize the importance of truth, that our knowledge systems have value and have shaped the modern world in ways that have too often gone unacknowledged. As researchers continue to uncover more documents related to James Redbird's work, a more complex and disturbing picture has emerged about how deeply Cherokee mathematical concepts influenced America's nuclear program. Recently declassified files from the Department of Energy archives reveal that Redbird's contribution extended far beyond the initial implosion mechanism design, reaching into multiple classified weapons programs that continued for decades after World War II ended. Dr. Marcus Whitecloud's persistent efforts to access these files have uncovered a paper trail leading to a classified facility in eastern Tennessee that operated from 1946 until 1973 under the codename Sequoia Point. This facility, officially designated as a theoretical physics research station, appears to have been dedicated to further developing applications of what internal documents called CR mathematical systems, CR presumably standing for Cherokee Redbird. What's remarkable about these documents is how explicitly they reference the Cherokee origins of the mathematical frameworks being used, notes Dr. Whitecloud. Unlike the Manhattan Project records, which systematically erased Redbird's contributions, these later programs seem to have embraced the indigenous origins of the concepts, at least internally, behind the veil of top-secret classification. One document, a research directive dated April 1949, specifically instructs scientists to reference original CR formulations derived from traditional Cherokee mathematical principles, particularly regarding multidimensional symmetry and balanced force distribution. The directive goes on to specify that all such research remained classified at the highest level and was restricted to those with constellation clearance, apparently a special security classification above even the standard top-secret designations. Why would military researchers be more willing to acknowledge the Cherokee origins of these concepts in internal documents while continuing to hide them from public view? The answer appears to lie in the growing realization among weapons scientists that Redbird's approach offered mathematical insights that conventional Western approaches couldn't match. There's a fascinating memo from 1952 written by Dr. Edward Teller, known as the father of the hydrogen bomb, explains nuclear historian Patricia Strongbow. In it, Teller argues that the CR approach to multidimensional force harmonization represents a mathematical framework without parallel in conventional physics. Its indigenous origins, far from being a liability, may be its greatest strength, as it approaches problems from philosophical perspectives unfamiliar to Western scientific tradition. This acknowledgement by one of America's most prominent nuclear physicists suggests that the military and scientific establishment had come to recognize the value of Cherokee mathematical traditions, even as they continued to deny public recognition to those traditions and to Redbird himself. Even more significant was the discovery of correspondence between James Redbird and various government officials in the years following the war. Despite the secrecy agreements he had signed, Redbird apparently made multiple attempts to gain recognition for Cherokee mathematical contributions and to influence how his work was being applied. In a letter to President Truman dated October 3, 1949, Redbird wrote, "I understand the necessity for secrecy regarding specific weapons applications, but the underlying mathematical principles derived from Cherokee traditional knowledge deserve acknowledgement. These principles extend far beyond destructive applications and could advance peaceful scientific endeavors if properly recognized and studied." The letter was never delivered to Truman. Instead, it was intercepted by military intelligence and placed in a special file marked CR Security Concerns, a response drafted by Pentagon officials but never sent to Redbird noted, "Subjects' concerns about cultural recognition pose significant security risks. Recommend continued monitoring and restriction of publication privileges." See, this policy of suppression continued even as Redbird's ideas were being applied to new generations of nuclear weapons. Documents from the late 1950s show that the multi-point symmetric implosion system used in the Mark 15 nuclear bomb, a staple of America's nuclear arsenal during the early Cold War, was directly derived from Redbird's original equations. They basically took the Cherokee mathematical framework and applied it to increasingly powerful weapons without ever acknowledging where these ideas came from. Notes Dr. Silverhawk, it's colonial appropriation at its most consequential. Indigenous knowledge being used to create the ultimate expression of Western military power. Redbird appears to have been aware of these developments despite his official exclusion from classified weapons work after the war. His journal entries from this period reveal a man deeply troubled by how his adaptation of traditional knowledge was being used. "I dream of circles within circles, forces perfectly balanced until they collapse inward with unimaginable violence," he wrote in 1957. The elders taught that the seven-pointed star represents harmony between all elements of creation. We have taken this harmony and turned it toward destruction. This is not what our ancestors intended when they developed these understandings of the universe. By the early 1960s, Redbird's health had begun to decline, but his concern about the military applications of Cherokee mathematical concepts remained strong. In 1962, he attempted to publish a paper titled Traditional Indigenous Mathematical Systems and Their Modern Applications, which carefully avoided any explicit mention of weapons work, but outlined the basic theoretical framework he had developed. The paper was blocked from publication by government censors. A memo from the Department of Defense to the FBI, dated March 19, 1962, states, "Subject's attempted publication references mathematical concepts currently classified under constellation protocols. While no explicit weapons information is disclosed, the underlying principles remain restricted. Publication must be prevented, and all copies secured." Despite these setbacks, Redbird continued teaching at Sequoia High School, where he found ways to incorporate traditional Cherokee mathematical concepts into his curriculum without explicitly connecting them to his classified work. Former students recall how he would draw the seven-pointed star on the blackboard and explain its significance as representing balance between different forces in the universe. He would tell us that our ancestors understood the fundamental nature of reality in ways that modern science was only beginning to grasp. Remembers John Running Deer, who studied under Redbird in the 1960s and later became a physicist himself. At the time, we thought he was just trying to instill cultural pride. It wasn't until decades later that I realized he was actually teaching us concepts that had been used in advanced weapons physics. As the Cold War intensified, Redbird's work was applied to increasingly sophisticated weapons systems. Newly declassified documents reveal that the Multiple Independently Targetable Re-Entry Vehicle, MIRV, technology, which allowed a single missile to carry several nuclear warheads targeted at different locations, utilized mathematical principles directly derived from Redbird's work on multidimensional symmetry. The concept of balanced separation in three-dimensional space, while maintaining optimal trajectory harmonization, described in MIRV development documents from 1964, is essentially a direct application of what Redbird called the path of seven directions in his original work, explains Dr. Whitecloud. This was a traditional Cherokee concept describing how seven distinct paths could emerge from a single point and maintain perfect balance, a concept he had translated into sophisticated mathematical equations. The irony was profound. A mathematical tradition developed by a people who had experienced forced relocation and cultural suppression at the hands of the U.S. Government was now being used to create America's most advanced weapon systems, all while that same government continued to deny recognition to the indigenous origins of these concepts. In 1967, as American military involvement in Vietnam escalated, Redbird made one final attempt to reclaim his legacy. He wrote directly to Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, who by then had been marginalized from weapons work due to security concerns, but remained a respected figure in the scientific community. After all these years of silence, Redbird wrote, "I feel compelled to speak the truth about the origins of the work we did together. The world should know that the mathematical principles at the heart of these weapons come from Cherokee traditional knowledge, not to glorify destruction, but to understand that all knowledge exists in a moral context. The elders taught that power without wisdom leads to imbalance, and imbalance eventually leads to collapse. I fear we have created a terrible imbalance in the world." Oppenheimer's response, found among his personal papers after his death, was sympathetic but cautious. "I share your concerns about the moral implications of our work. As you know, the question of proper attribution for the mathematical concepts is complex given the security considerations that still prevail. I can only say that history, if it is honest, will eventually recognize all contributions to this momentous and terrible development in human affairs. That recognition would not come during either man's lifetime." Oppenheimer died in 1967, just months after receiving Redbird's letter. Redbird himself would live another 16 years, increasingly troubled by nightmares and what his family describes as episodes of spiritual distress related to his work. "In his final years, my father would sometimes wake up screaming in Cherokee," recalls Sarah Redbird Johnson. "He would say that he could see the atoms splitting, feel the balance of creation being disrupted. Traditional healers were brought in, but they said his spirit was caught between worlds, the world of traditional knowledge and the world of modern weapons that had misused that knowledge." James Redbird died in 1983. His contributions to nuclear weapons development still classified and unknown to all but a handful of military officials and scientists with the highest security clearances. The obituary in the local Tahlequah newspaper mentioned only that he had served his country during World War II and had been a respected teacher and cultural preservationist within the Cherokee Nation. The story might have ended there, another example of indigenous contribution erased from historical record, if not for two key developments. The first was the end of the Cold War, which led to the declassification of many previously secret documents related to nuclear weapons development. The second was the persistent effort of Redbird's family and researchers like Dr. Whitecloud to uncover the truth about his work. "We submitted our first Freedom of Information Act request in 1995, explains Dr. Whitecloud. The initial response was a flat denial that any records existed relating to James Redbird and nuclear weapons research. It took 7 appeals, 3 lawsuits, and congressional intervention before we received the first heavily redacted documents in 2004. Even now, more than 75 years after the original work, significant portions of Redbird's contributions remain classified. Sodit. What has emerged from these documents, however, is a story that fundamentally challenges our understanding of scientific history and raises profound questions about cultural appropriation, recognition, and the military application of indigenous knowledge. The standard narrative of nuclear weapons development centers European and Euro-American scientists almost exclusively, notes Dr. Silverhawk. The reality is far more complex. Indigenous mathematical concepts, translated by a Cherokee physicist, played a crucial role in creating functional implosion weapons. This isn't just a footnote to history. It's a fundamental reframing of how knowledge is created, who gets credit, and how traditional wisdom can contain insights that anticipate modern scientific discoveries. See, the implications extend beyond historical correction. As more details of Redbird's work emerge from declassified documents, physicists and mathematicians are beginning to recognize that his adaptation of Cherokee mathematical concepts may have applications far beyond weapons development, in fields ranging from quantum computing to environmental science to medical imaging. What's particularly valuable about the Cherokee mathematical tradition that Redbird drew upon is its holistic approach to complex systems, explains theoretical physicist Dr. Maria Falcon. Western mathematical traditions tend to be reductionist, breaking systems down into component parts. The Cherokee approach that Redbird utilized starts from the assumption of interconnectedness and seeks to describe the relationships and balance between different elements of a system. This turns out to be incredibly useful for understanding quantum entanglement, complex environmental interactions, and other phenomena that defy simple reductionist analysis. This recognition has led to growing interest in what scholars are now calling ethnomathematics, the study of mathematical concepts and traditions from different cultural perspectives. Several universities have begun research programs focused specifically on indigenous mathematical traditions, with the Cherokee system receiving particular attention due to the newly revealed evidence of its sophisticated applications. What Redbird did was translate between knowledge systems, explains Dr. Kevin Whitefeather, a mathematician and member of the Cherokee Nation who is leading one such research program at the University of Oklahoma. He understood both traditional Cherokee mathematical concepts and Western scientific notation. He could see connections and applications that weren't visible to scientists trained exclusively in the Western tradition. This translation between knowledge systems was precisely what made Redbird's contribution so valuable to the Manhattan Project, and what makes it so significant for contemporary science. But it also raises difficult questions about appropriation and recognition. The history of Western science is full of examples where indigenous knowledge was extracted, stripped of its cultural context, repackaged in Western scientific language, and then credited to Western scientists, notes Dr. Silverhawk. The Redbird case is unusual only in the scale of impact and the level of classification that kept it hidden for so long. For the Cherokee Nation, the gradual revelation of Redbird's role in nuclear weapons development has prompted deep reflection about the relationship between traditional knowledge and modern applications. In 2017, the Tribal Council passed a resolution calling for full declassification of all documents related to Redbird's work and formal recognition of Cherokee mathematical contributions to nuclear science. Our traditional knowledge was developed over thousands of years of careful observation and thinking about the natural world, says Principal Chief Walkingstick. It was intended to help us live in harmony with creation, not to create weapons of mass destruction. But we cannot deny the historical reality of how this knowledge was used. What we can do is insist on proper recognition and engage in conversation about the ethical implications of different applications of traditional knowledge. That conversation has expanded as more details of the Cherokee Constellation program have come to light. Recently declassified documents reveal that Redbird's mathematical frameworks were applied not only to nuclear weapons, but to a variety of other military technologies throughout the Cold War. From ballistic missile guidance systems to early stealth technology to advanced submarine propulsion. There's a 1972 memo from the Office of Naval Research that explicitly references CR mathematical principles regarding fluid dynamics and balanced propulsion systems in the context of a classified submarine program, notes military historian Dr. Robert Thunderhawk. This suggests that Redbird's adaptation of Cherokee mathematical concepts had applications far beyond nuclear physics. It was being used across multiple domains of military technology. The extent of this influence became even clearer with the declassification of a 1981 report titled Assessment of CR Mathematical Applications in Advanced Weapons Systems. The heavily redacted document nevertheless makes clear that what began with Redbird's work on the Manhattan Project had evolved into a comprehensive mathematical framework used across multiple classified programs. The CR approach to multidimensional force harmonization remains unparalleled in conventional physics, states the report. Its application has provided significant advantages in redacted systems, redacted guidance, and redacted stealth technologies. Recommendation: continue level alpha classification of all CR-derived methodologies to maintain strategic advantage. In other words, mathematical concepts derived from Cherokee traditional knowledge had become so valuable to American military technology that they were being protected as state secrets of the highest order, even as the indigenous origins of these concepts remained unacknowledged in any public forum. This systematic erasure of indigenous contribution extends beyond Redbird himself. As more documents become available, evidence has emerged that other Native American scientists and mathematicians were recruited for classified projects throughout the Cold War, their work similarly hidden behind security classifications and their cultural knowledge appropriated without recognition. We've identified at least 17 Native American scientists who worked on classified projects between 1942 and 1989, where there's evidence that traditional knowledge influenced their scientific contributions, says Dr. Silverhawk. Their stories remain largely untold, their contributions unrecognized. For Sarah Redbird Johnson and her family, the gradual emergence of her father's story represents both validation and continued frustration. "We always knew that my father had done important work during the war," she says, "but the full extent of his contribution and how it continued to influence military technology for decades afterward was hidden even from us. Now, we're learning that his adaptation of Cherokee mathematics shaped American military power for nearly half a century. Yet he died without any recognition. The lack of recognition extended beyond public acknowledgement to material compensation. While many scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project went on to prestigious academic positions, consulting arrangements with defense contractors, or leadership roles in national laboratories, Redbird returned to teaching high school mathematics on the Cherokee Reservation at a fraction of the salary his white colleagues commanded. There's a 1958 letter in his personal papers where he inquired about consulting opportunities with a defense contractor working on missile guidance systems, notes Dr. Whitecloud. The response was that security concerns made such an arrangement impossible. Yet we now know that this same contractor was actively using mathematical principles derived from Redbird's work. They just didn't want him involved because his role was supposed to remain classified. This economic disparity reflected broader patterns of discrimination. Even as the U.S. government was utilizing indigenous knowledge to create its most advanced weapon systems, Native Americans continued to face systematic oppression, including forced assimilation policies, economic marginalization, and cultural suppression. During the same period when Redbird's mathematical frameworks were being applied to new generations of nuclear weapons, the federal government was pursuing a policy of termination aimed at ending the special status of Native American tribes and forcing assimilation into mainstream American society. The irony of appropriating indigenous knowledge while simultaneously attempting to eradicate indigenous cultural identity was not lost on Redbird himself. "They take what they find useful from our traditions and discard the rest," he wrote in his journal in 1957. "They use our mathematical understanding to build weapons while telling our children that our traditions are primitive superstition. This is not just hypocrisy. It is spiritual theft." Yotu, that spiritual dimension is central to understanding the full significance of the Redbird story. For the Cherokee and many other indigenous nations, knowledge is not merely instrumental. It exists within a moral and spiritual context. Mathematical principles like those Redbird adapted were traditionally understood as descriptions of the balance and harmony in creation, inseparable from ethical considerations about how they should be applied. In Cherokee tradition, The seven-pointed star represents the seven directions: north, south, east, west, up, down, and center, all in perfect balance, explains Thomas Firecrow. This concept was used to understand everything from astronomical observations to community structure to personal spiritual development. It was never separated from questions of right relationship and harmony between all elements of creation. When this holistic understanding was translated into the compartmentalized world of classified weapons research, something essential was lost. The mathematical framework was extracted from its cultural and ethical context, its power harnessed for purposes that directly contradicted the values embedded in the traditional knowledge system from which it emerged. This is the deepest tragedy of the Redbird story, says Dr. Whitecloud. Not just that he didn't receive credit, but that the knowledge he translated between worlds was stripped of its ethical framework and spiritual context. The Cherokee mathematical tradition he drew upon was inseparable from an understanding of balance and harmony in the universe. The weapons it helped create represented the ultimate disruption of that harmony. Redbird himself became increasingly troubled by this contradiction as he aged. His later journals, written in a mixture of Cherokee and English, reveal a man wrestling with the moral implications of his work and seeking spiritual reconciliation for what he had helped create. "I have taken the sacred geometry of creation and used it to build instruments of destruction," he wrote in 1971. "The imbalance this has created cannot be resolved in my lifetime. Perhaps it cannot be resolved at all. I can only hope that future generations will find ways to apply this knowledge toward healing rather than harm, toward balance rather than domination." That hope has begun to be realized in small ways. As knowledge of Cherokee mathematical traditions has slowly emerged from behind the veil of classification, researchers in fields ranging from environmental science to medicine to quantum computing have begun exploring how these concepts might be applied in non-military contexts. At the University of Oklahoma's Indigenous Mathematics Research Center, Dr. Whitefeather and his colleagues are studying how the Cherokee concept of seven-dimensional harmony can be applied to climate modeling, offering new approaches to understanding complex environmental systems. At Johns Hopkins University, medical researchers are investigating how Redbird's work on symmetrical implosion can be reversed to develop more effective drug delivery systems that disperse medications precisely within the human body. What's emerging is the recognition that indigenous knowledge systems often contain insights that anticipate or complement the most advanced frontiers of contemporary science, explains Dr. Falcon. The Cherokee mathematical tradition that Redbird drew upon offers sophisticated ways of understanding complex systems, multidimensional relationships, and balance within dynamic processes, all areas where conventional Western mathematical approaches often struggle. This recognition represents a form of belated validation for Redbird's work and for indigenous knowledge more broadly. But it also raises questions about who controls and benefits from these applications. The history of Redbird's contributions to nuclear weapons development stands as a cautionary tale about the appropriation of indigenous knowledge without respect for its cultural context or proper attribution to its origins. As interest in indigenous knowledge grows within scientific communities, we must ensure that the patterns of the past aren't repeated, warns Dr. Silverhawk. This means not just acknowledgement of sources, but meaningful involvement of indigenous knowledge keepers in determining appropriate applications, proper protocols for knowledge sharing, and equitable distribution of any benefits that arise. For the Cherokee Nation, the Redbird story has catalyzed new initiatives aimed at preserving and promoting traditional mathematical knowledge while ensuring it is shared and applied in ways consistent with Cherokee values. In 2020, the tribe established the James Redbird Center for Indigenous Mathematics, dedicated to documenting, teaching, and ethically applying traditional mathematical concepts in contemporary contexts. Our goal is to ensure that our mathematical traditions serve life and balance, as they were intended to do, explains Dr. Rebecca Morningstar, the center's director. We're working with scientists across multiple disciplines to explore applications in environmental restoration, medicine, sustainable energy, areas where these concepts can promote healing rather than destruction. This approach represents what many indigenous scholars call decolonizing science, not rejecting modern scientific methods, but integrating them with traditional knowledge systems in ways that respect the cultural context and ethical frameworks of indigenous traditions. What Redbird did in translating between knowledge systems was revolutionary, says Dr. Whitecloud, but it was done under conditions of secrecy and appropriation that prevented the full potential of that translation from being realized. Now, we have the opportunity to continue his work of bringing these knowledge systems into dialogue, but to do so openly and ethically, with proper recognition and respect. That recognition has been slow in coming at the official level. Despite multiple petitions from the Cherokee Nation and support from several members of Congress, the Department of Energy and Department of Defense have continued to resist full declassification of documents related to Redbird's work, citing ongoing national security concerns. A statement from the Department of Energy in response to a 2020 Freedom of Information Act appeal notes that certain mathematical principles derived from the work of Dr. James Redbird remain integral to current weapon systems and therefore must remain classified. CD, the statement represents the first official acknowledgement of Redbird's role, but continues to restrict access to details of his contributions. For Sarah Redbird Johnson, now in her 80s, the continuing classification of her father's work represents an ongoing injustice. My father believed in both worlds, the traditional Cherokee world and the world of modern science, she says. He tried to build bridges between them, to show that indigenous knowledge had value in addressing the challenges of the modern world. Instead, his work was taken, hidden away, and used for purposes that violated the very principles embedded in that knowledge. As she speaks, she holds a small wooden carving of the seven-pointed star that her father made for her when she was a child. He told me this represented balance in all things, she recalls, that every force must be met with a counterbalancing force. That harmony comes from recognizing the interconnectedness of all elements of creation. That's what the math he developed was really about. Not destruction, but harmony. Not dominance, but balance. The story of James Redbird and the Cherokee Constellation Program continues to unfold as more documents are declassified and more researchers focus on uncovering this hidden history. What has already emerged, however, fundamentally challenges conventional narratives about scientific development, indigenous knowledge, and the complex relationship between traditional wisdom and modern technology. The Redbird case demonstrates that indigenous knowledge systems contain sophisticated understandings that can contribute significantly to addressing complex challenges, concludes Dr. Silverhawk. But it also warns us about the dangers of extracting this knowledge without respecting its cultural context or acknowledging its origins. As we face global challenges from climate change to pandemics, the dialogue between knowledge systems becomes increasingly important. But it must be a dialogue based on respect, recognition, and reciprocity. In the end, perhaps the most important aspect of the Redbird story is not the specific mathematical principles he developed or their applications in weapons systems, but the questions it raises about knowledge, power, and ethical responsibility. How do we honor the wisdom embedded in traditional knowledge systems while applying it to contemporary challenges? How do we ensure that indigenous contributions are recognized and respected rather than appropriated and erased? And how do we use knowledge, from whatever tradition it emerges, in ways that promote life and harmony rather than destruction? These are questions that James Redbird wrestled with throughout his life. Questions that continue to resonate as his story emerges from the classified shadows of history. They are questions that remind us that knowledge never exists in a vacuum, It always carries with it responsibilities and choices about how it will be applied. In one of his final journal entries, written just months before his death in 1983, Redbird reflected on the legacy of his work. Knowledge is like water. It can nurture life or erode foundations, depending on how it flows. The math I helped develop could destroy cities, or it could help us understand the deepest harmonies of the universe. The choice belongs to future generations now. I pray they will choose wisely, that they will bend the arc of this knowledge back toward its original purpose, understanding the beautiful balance that sustains all life. As the sun sets over the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma, casting long shadows across the land that has sustained Redbird's people for generations, these words stand as both caution and invitation, a reminder of the responsibility that comes with knowledge and the possibility of directing that knowledge toward healing rather than harm, toward balance rather than domination. What other indigenous knowledge remains hidden in classified archives? What other contributions have been erased from official histories? And most importantly, how might traditional wisdom help us address the challenges we face today? Not as relics of the past, but as living traditions with profound relevance for our shared future. The answers to these questions may determine not just how we understand history, but how we navigate the complex challenges of the present moment. As James Redbird understood, knowledge is never neutral. It either serves life or undermines it, promotes harmony or creates imbalance. The choice of how to use it belongs to all of us. In this moment of global crisis and potential transformation, perhaps the most important lesson from the Redbird story is that wisdom can emerge from unexpected sources, that solutions to our most pressing problems may lie in knowledge traditions that have been marginalized and dismissed. If we are wise enough to listen, humble enough to learn, and ethical enough to apply this wisdom with respect for its origins and intentions. And as we face the uncertainties of our troubled world, may we turn to God and Jesus Christ for guidance in using knowledge wisely, in recognizing the sacred in all traditions of understanding, and in building a future where indigenous wisdom is honored rather than appropriated, where balance is restored rather than disrupted, and where the terrible power unleashed by Redbird's equations is finally directed toward life rather than death.